Surprise, surprise, but Morbius is bad. It's an absolute unmitigated disaster of franchise filmmaking, and quite frankly, one of the worst comic book films I have ever seen. For the better part of a decade, Sony has been desperately trying to build a Spider-Man cinematic universe to rival the MCU. It's just, that's hilarious when you really just, that's hilariously sad when you really think about it. Without putting in the effort to understand why Kevin Feige's interconnected universe is a success to begin with. Whether it was their shoehorned attempt at a Sinister Six movie post The Amazing Spider-Man 2, or the Aunt May super spy film, still can't believe I'm saying that, but that was a movie that actually existed, remember that? Or the laughable Venom 2 No Way Home post-credit tandem, our Lord and Savior Avi Arad can't help but continue to put the cart before the horse.
I can't control it!
Rushing to get to the big fanboy team-up moments while actively ignoring the fact that you will never succeed at turning it all into something tangible if the story you tell around that fan service is both terrible and non-existent. And so now, we've been subjected to Morbius, a movie that's been in development hell for the better part of 3 years, and it's easily Sony's most forced, lazy, and amateur attempt at trying to make the Sony Spider-Verse happen. Because you see, Morbius doesn't even have the honor, the great privilege of being called a movie. Yeah. It's nothing more than a 90-minute tease to tie in two really bad post-credit scenes that make less and less sense the more you think about them. It's one of the most nonsensically aimless, our plot has gone missing movies that I think I've ever seen, honestly. It's an hour and a half of Jared Leto and Matt Smith acting opposite one another, putting in an effort that the movie doesn't deserve to absolutely no end. And even Jared Leto is devoid of his weird charm here, like he's scarily normal. I don't like it. Look, it's easy to just dismiss a movie and say, nothing happens, what the hell? But I'm honestly not kidding. Nothing happens in this movie. There's hardly a story. It's more like fragments loosely stitched together until it ends. No character, no emotional core, no structure. The film starts, and every moment, following a weirdly out-of-place Stranger Things-esque title sequence, the film couldn't be more in a hurry to be over with, and yet, it commits the worst sin of all. It's
boring. Delete.
If the writers, filmmakers, studio, whoever is ultimately responsible with this mess doesn't care enough about the characters and property they have to give them even the bare essentials needed to tell a story, then why should we? It's the most empty, cynical form of content creation. Yes, I'm using the word content because, as we've already discussed, Morbius isn't a movie, and Sony clearly doesn't view it as such. In the process, one of Spider-Man's coolest, most sympathetic, layered, and complex antagonists gets an absolutely garbage big screen debut from a studio that doesn't see him as a rich character ripe for mining, but a means to expand their already failed Spider-Verse. No, not that one, the live-action one. One that Kevin Feige, if he has any sense, would get the hell away from yesterday. Once again, Morbius shows that Sony has absolutely no idea what they're doing. To that end, what the hell have they done with this movie? What have they done? Hey, yeah, Dr. Mike, you mind elaborating on that there?
I should have died years ago. Why am I still here if not to consume liquid IV?
Well, yeah, Dr. Mike, I agree. Liquid IV is great. Their hydration multiplier is an electrolyte drink mix with fantastic flavor, I have to say.
But beyond the taste, this is an amazing product that has a healing power of its own. Drinking just one hydration multiplier powered by cellular transport technology enhances rapid absorption of water and hydrates faster than drinking water by itself. Whether I'm working out or flying around with bats or just keeping up my general daily intake of fluids, staying hydrated is, after all, the first and most important step towards staying healthy.
You know, this guy's actually kind of onto something.
Listen, who's the real doctor here? I am, and I've been adding hydration multiplier to my diet for years, and it's become my go-to for everyday hydration. It's easy to pack and carry as well, whether I'm on the go around New York City, flying around, or enjoying a relaxing weekend at home. So whether you have basic fitness goals or you're a hyperactive creature of the night like myself, you should try out Liquid IV. Their amazing products are available at Costco, including their best-selling flavor, Lemon Lime Hydration Multiplier. My personal favorite is strawberry, but I bet you can guess why. Check out the link in the description below. Use my code FilmSpeak for 25% off your next refill.
Cool. Thanks, Dr. Michael Morbius, for telling us about Liquid IV. And you know what? Thank you, Liquid IV, for sponsoring this video.
What is this?
What is this?
What is that?
What is that?
What is this?
Yeah, I sympathize with those puppets. They are all of us watching Morbius. My God. And you know what the sad thing is? It kind of ropes you in at first, too. The first idea the movie has to establish Michael Morbius traveling to Costa Rica in order to develop a cure for his blood disease makes sense and creates an interesting introduction to the character for about 5 to 10 minutes before it abruptly pulls a 25 years earlier on us and thrusts us back to his childhood in one of the worst flashback sequences I've ever seen in a comic book film. There's nothing to establish or shift in time frame, and even less to bring us back to the present. The flashback is bad because it doesn't have a proper foundation to attach itself to the rest of the film. It doesn't do anything to invest you in it. It just happens, jumps through a few random moments, and then is over as abruptly as it began, and I'm still not entirely sure when that is. It flashes back 25 years earlier, but then rushes through the backstory that establishes the core of the film. The relationship the whole movie is centered around between Morbius and Milo. It spends all of 5 minutes with them at the home Morbius is staying in. Morbius gives Milo his name, they quote the Spartans, and then apparently form this unbreakable lifelong friendship, even though Michael leaves moments later because he's been accepted into a gifted school in New York. No, don't worry, not that one. The film is too lazy to give us any real emotional attachment to Michael and Milo and why their friendship is so strong. Why should we care about them? It's only concerned with expounding a required plot point in a half-ass attempt to give the movie any sort of emotional investment in the main characters. Then suddenly, Morbius is being honored with a Nobel Prize or whatever, and he rejects it because he's supposed to be a good, upstanding, selfless person given his creation of artificial blood, even though his entire quest is kind of a selfish attempt to cure his own rare blood disease. I don't know, but hey, the film clearly doesn't want you to think about that too hard because now he's getting his PhD, now he's talking to Jared Harris for the ntth time, now he's erasing human DNA with bat DNA he got from Costa Rica. So now we're in the present again, I think? I really don't know. Does that seem confusing to you? Imagine what it felt like watching it. Okay, so the timeline and plot structure are a mess, but what if it were possible to look past this because the character we're following is phenomenally well written and defined? Well, no, not really. I mean, maybe there's nobility in Morbius's quest, noble intentions, but I think the point is that he's trying to play God because of his own condition, similar to how he was in the comics. I wish I could say for certain, but the film doesn't actually explore the idea behind a guy who deludes himself into thinking he's doing a good thing, when in actuality he's created a monster and is cursed with the stain of his own ego. The comic character of Michael Morbius is complex in that regard, loaded with a conversation about that dichotomy. He's always been a character you can sympathize with because of what happened, but ultimately he's got his own ego and inner demon that can make him villainous. It made him a fantastic villain in the comics, and particularly in one of the Spider-Man animated series' best arcs. But none of that can be found here because the movie just shoves this guy who wants to get rid of a blood disease onto the screen, shows us a brief connection with his pseudo-brother, and then jumps through his story so lightning fast that there's nothing to ponder or invest ourselves in. The fascinating thing about Morbius is that he's the anti-vampire. He's a vampire who hates being a vampire, which is why he's always trying to find a cure to unvampire himself. At first, his obsession was to rid himself of his disease and save his life, but once the timing on his mortality was solved, he's burdened with much worse. The tragedy of Morbius is the eternal damnation and struggle back to normalcy. He's constantly fighting the beast within, like Jekyll and Hyde or Bruce Banner and the Hulk. His condition that leads him to desperately experimenting on himself prevents him from dying, but at a far greater cost. This impossible situation and endless quest in search of a cure adds to the sympathy of the character and makes for someone that you want to root for, even if the monster within sometimes gets the upper upper hand. In the film version, the tireless obsession over finding a cure for both his blood disease and his transformation into being a vampire doesn't feel as dire or sympathetic as it should. Half the time, Morbius is simply testing the limits of his abilities, almost in awe of his newfound powers. The film painting his thirst for human blood as unfortunate, but hey, look, he's a superhero, cool, right? There are a few moments where you can sense a sliver of Morbius's misery, but it's hardly enough, and the film itself can't even decide whether Morbius enjoys being a vampire or is haunted by it. In one scene, Michael will be having a weirdly jovial conversation with his supposed love interest Martine, making light of his condition, only to proceed or follow that up with scenes showing how guilty and hurt he feels by it. The film can't decide whether he should learn to embrace both halves of himself or tirelessly search for a cure. It's one thing to write a morally gray character who's struggling with a crisis of conscience, but it's another to use that as an excuse to do nothing with the character, explore none of these ideas more than skin deep. It also doesn't help when you have a post-credits scene where the Vulture comes to recruit Morbius to team up and do God knows what. Like, why the hell would Morbius want to do that? What beef does he have with Spider-Man? We've never seen him interact with Spider-Man. We've never seen Spider-Man wrong him, and Morbius, for the most part, is doing his own thing. He's living with his own curse, and he's trying to find a solution, or I don't know what they're really trying to do with it because the film, again, can't really decide. This is kind of a larger issue with Sony's anti-hero kick. They work overtime to make characters like Venom, Morbius, and I'm assuming Kraven once we get to that film, but I'll reserve judgment until I see or hear anything, misunderstood heroes, as if to say that they're good guys that just happen to kill people. It's this edgy, pioneering approach to character that is like someone's random shake things up kind of idea that Sony just jumped on because it's interesting, I guess? Not only is there no depth to it, but it doesn't even largely make sense for these characters. I'm sorry, but Venom was primarily a villain for a good chunk of his initial run, until he and Spidey had to team up out of necessity, and due to the character's iconography and popularity, it's been a process to make him more and more of an anti-hero. So I guess with Venom, the anti-hero treatment kind of makes sense, even if it would have been better to lean into the villain thing, but hey, that's just my take. Morbius has also teamed up with heroes in the past, but he's also had a larger chunk of time where he's been the villain. My point is, it's not that they're telling stories about anti-heroes, it's that they've worked so hard to absolve them of their villainy that they don't even feel like anti-heroes anymore. It feels like they're just trying to sell them as good guys outright because the Spider-Man universe has more villains naturally than it does heroes. This being in spite of all the villainous stuff that we see them do. We get a montage of tests and trials that play out as the general about section of a Morbius Wikipedia page, listing out all of his powers and showing him becoming one with the bats, while the music and visuals blatantly rip off the far superior Batman Begins. I'm not even joking, look at this. Hans Zimmer should be getting royalties from that. He should be suing. Nolan should be suing. So what now? Normally, in a better written film, the protagonist would attempt to try and find a way to live with what's happened to them, and we see that to an extent. However, the film doesn't entirely know what to do with that, so it brings in Matt Smith's character to point the story in a new direction. There's actually the potential for a really compelling look at addiction, especially in the face of certain death, depression, feeling lesser than, debilitation, how the high, the fever, that rush both Morbius and Milo get from feeding on real blood gives them this euphoric confidence. It feels good to them. They feel like they're the apex on the top of the food chain. They finally feel superior and accepted in a world where they've been fighting to stay alive. The filmmakers try to do this red pill, blue pill thing, echoing the Matrix, with the blue blood, artificial, being what grounds them and satisfies their hunger temporarily, and the red blood, the real blood, lets the monster out. Admittedly, it's an interesting idea that takes the thematic motif from The Matrix and kind of twists it. It could be an interesting homage, it really could be, but it plays more like an obvious gimmick. Like, it almost misunderstands the point of the red pill, blue pill thing in The Matrix in an effort to tie it into vampires and make Morbius choose between succumbing to the monster within, like Milo, or learning to bear the cost of his arrogance. So I guess in this scenario, you should absolutely be taking the blue pill. Even the way I'm talking about that feels like I'm giving the screenwriters more credit than they deserve. None of this is given the proper time of day, and that idea of addiction isn't even remotely explored or thought of throughout the course of this film. Morbius is a bunch of interesting, half-baked ideas that are simultaneously, almost paradoxically, overcooked because the film doesn't do anything with them aside from somewhat introduce them and then pivots to the next thing in order to get the film over and done with. The artificial blood Morbius has created can only satiate him for so long before he has to resort to the real thing, like a drug addiction. It's a fascinating idea that ties into making Morbius a far more complex protagonist. It leans more into the anti-hero angle more than making him a straight-up good guy, since the only person Morbius really kills are racist mercenaries on a freighter. Don't even get me started on that. That was weird and random, as if we needed to justify Morbius wreaking havoc on mercenaries on a freighter. Anyways, and the villain, Milo, at the end. He doesn't fully earn the title of Spider-Man villain or anti-hero. Morbius and Milo have as much personality as Jared Leto and Matt Smith can give them, but despite the efforts put forth by the performances, they're so thin, and as I'm sure you've guessed, that's definitely down to the writing. Especially Morbius, who has no semblance of a characterization at all. I have no idea who this guy is, what he believes in. He's just this blank slate of nothingness. This whole story is built on the backbone of Milo and Michael's deeply intimate friendship. Hence why the movie goes out of its way in the first 5 minutes to abruptly show us its origins, and then over the ensuing hour and a half, it goes untouched save for one line that Morbius says to Milo, "Like the Spartans, we are the few against the many," referring of course to their rare blood disease making them outcasts, that apparently was so monumental it bound the two together for life. Really? Like, I would imagine if these two lifelong friends have 25 years worth of a relationship, there would be more to mine than simply the first words they exchanged. And even in the scene, it felt like a throwaway line. I'm not shortchanging that encounter. Sure, there are many of first encounters that go on to have monumental effects on a person's life, but to me, it was apparent that the screenwriters based everything around that one line because they couldn't be bothered to properly develop that relationship. So they were just going to rely on that line as shorthand instead of actually doing the work to realize the meaning behind that line. And just to go one step further, it's not even a line that they wrote. The characters were quoting the Spartans. Just baffling. Ugh. On top of that, outside of the one scene of Milo being bullied, we're never actually shown how mistreated both Michael and Milo are, how society has rejected them and forced them into desperation. I just don't buy it. I see nothing to indicate any of this. This idea that they're surrogate brothers falls apart because the movie doesn't develop it at all. Yeah, the actors have fine chemistry, but that's just the actors being good at their jobs and doing the best they can with next to nothing. The film, once again, just can't be bothered to let its story, its scenes, its characters breathe because it doesn't care about any of it. All this movie cares about is rushing forward to the Spider-Man tie-ins. It gets even worse later on when the movie suddenly dumps Milo's angst on you, quickly vomiting out the detail that Milo is bitter because Morbius was always the favorite son to Jared Harris's character and was pitied rather than respected. At no point is that even remotely alluded to until that moment in the film. Sure, Milo was bullied and I guess holds a vendetta against people for undervaluing him or mistreating him, which contrasts nicely to Morbius, who used his intellect as a means to escape, but again, none of this is ever shown. This is just something that's told to us last minute, and more importantly, Milo is never shown to resent Morbius's successes or envy his status or the way society has chosen to accept him, but not Milo. It's literally just fodder for Jared Harris's absolutely wasted role to be killed off. It doesn't mean anything, and honestly, the movie probably would have been better off just not mentioning it at all. Morbius is a run-on of half-baked ideas and scenes with no emotional weight to them. On top of that, the movie is just devoid of fun. The tone is this dour, lifeless, self-serious drone that happens to have vampires on it. Morbius could have been a fun but dark, even slightly campy send-up of the vampire genre, something that leans into Jared Leto's personality and even Matt Smith's devilish charm and charisma. Even the sparse attempts at levity are so random and out of left field, it's almost as if the filmmakers realized they didn't have enough jokes, so randomly threw them in with awful ADR. Not to mention the jarring tonal clashes that happen as a result, but you know what? I digress. It's a miserable viewing experience. Compare that to, and I can't believe I'm saying this even though I do enjoy both films, Venom. However you might feel about those two Tom Hardy movies, both Venom films thrive on Tom Hardy's innate charisma as a performer and recognizes that it's not just Hardy being let loose that's entertaining, no. It's Tom Hardy acting opposite Tom Hardy in this heartfelt bromance relationship story that simultaneously functions as a one-man show. Venom knows damn well what it is and rolls with it, camp and all. Most of all, despite the schlocky B-grade entertainment, the Venom films have heart, some semblance of a soul at the center of them with legitimate care for the characters, which is far more than I can say for the ironically lifeless Morbius. Morbius doesn't know what it is other than an aimless half-assed attempt to recapture the early 2000s comic book movie craze. And it can't even do that well. It's like someone made what they thought an early 2000s comic book movie was without ever having watched one. I mean, if they really wanted to do a throwback to the late 90s, early 2000s vampire film, the Blade movies are right there. Morbius is so insincere in what it's doing that it doesn't even care to take advantage of the vampirical horror roots that make the character special. If anything else, Morbius could have just been a simple horror film about a genius cursed by his own ego, personified as a vampire, and played into the atmosphere, the scares, the imagery. Hell, it could have drawn upon the pulpiness of the Universal or Hammer monster movies to give the story any kind of unique identity, but it doesn't. It has no teeth, no pun intended, no flair, no spark, no creativity. And oh boy, those action sequences. Like the film itself, that first one actually is kind of decent. The way they show Morbius transforming, the way he looks when he moves, it works. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend it's some kind of revolution of CG and animation, but honestly, I was digging it, and it was a bit refreshing. After that initial sequence though, I mean, the character still generally looks and moves fine, but the way the scenes are shot just turns to absolute crap. The quick cutting, generic framing, and ultra dark cinematography is one thing, but then you add endless flurries of bats flying across the screen, and this is truly some incomprehensible nonsense. It reaches a crescendo of utter stupidity in the climax, when Morbius summons previously unmentioned powers such as a sudden swarm of thousands of bats in the middle of New York City? You know, normally I can go with these things, but this is just, there's been no attempt to explain anything that come on, really? And then even worse, he Dragon Ball Z's the shit out of the bad guy and kills him with a random serum Morbius has apparently been researching and developing off-screen as he meandered around New York City for the past 30 minutes searching for a hideout, pretending to be Venom. What the hell is this? What is this movie? What is Morbius? I'll tell you what Morbius is. It's a cynical ploy. I could easily spend another 15-20 minutes or so talking about how lame it was to have Morbius's girlfriend be the damsel in distress, how overdone that is for these movies at this point, or how about, even worse, they make her a literal sacrificial lamb. Like, she just gets killed and then Morbius, after crying over her body, feeds on her in order to fuel his vengeful battle against Milo. Baffling. It's like some kind of self-parody, vampires suck kind of scene. Except because the movie takes itself so goddamn seriously, it can't even be enjoyed from that so hilariously melodramatic and awful that it's entertaining kind of perspective. And then, surprise, she gets resurrected as a vampire because reasons. Sequels. I have no idea. Who the hell knows? Who cares? It's an entire movie of nothing, of just utter nonsense. It's honestly like they ripped entire scenes out of the movie, scenes which were important in order to tell an actual cohesive story, and just left something that barely constitutes a skeleton in the cut. The only reason Morbius exists is to get you to pay Sony money to watch its post-credit sequences. You know, the ones where Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, shows up from the MCU, breaking the rules of Stephen Strange's Everyone Forgets Peter Parker spell. And speaking of the MCU, I'm gonna iterate this again. Kevin Feige, run. Run far away from this garbage. Run away from the cynical, empty, soulless schlock of a film. Mahershala Ali's Blade shouldn't be tainted by association with this movie, no matter how great it would be to see Blade and Morbius clash together as they do in the comics. MCU Spidey also shouldn't be tainted by association with this. And for all of you Morbius fans, I am truly sorry. I'm truly sorry that the character you have loved your entire life and whose story would actually make for great material on the big screen was treated so carelessly by Sony. You know what? I'm not even gonna call Morbius a movie. It ain't. Let's just call it what it is and call it a day. Draining. Congrats, Sony. You sucked the life out of this one right from the start. Oh, God help us all.